Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Vihara.
Mukunda met Prabhupada first on the Lower East Side of New York. One of the very first disciples was Mukunda. And he came out west to meet me, and at that time my girlfriend Malati became Malati, and convinced us by his example that Srila Prabhupada, we was just called the Swami then, was his spiritual master. And knowing Mukunda so well and Jamuna so well and seeing them so convinced by one man, I didn't accept immediately. I spent about 3 months skeptically watching them. They'd given up meat eating, drugs, intoxication, gambling, sex, everything they'd given up. I was still doing all those things, and I just was waiting for their armor to crack so I could say, you see, he wasn't the right guy after all. But after 3 months of that, I just had to throw in the towel and say, hey, if this guy is happy all the time, doing what he's doing, and I'm always unhappy, why not give it a try? So I accepted Prabhupada through my friend, Mukunda. But the moment I saw Prabhupada, I knew that I'd made the right choice. And my first personal interaction with Prabhupada was the day after that dance at the Avalon Ballroom. He was living in an apartment above the temple on Frederick Street. And he had asked Mukunda, I think, who had put on this dance, who was responsible for this dance, and he'd said, well, Sam. Oh, bring him here. So he introduced me at that time. And Prabhupada says, you have made this money? How much money did you make last night? And I told him I thought it was about $2,000. I wasn't sure. That was really Melanie's department. She collected the money at the gate. And he said, oh, in those days that was a lot of money, especially for the Hare Krishnas. And he said, well then, those who make the money should know how to spend it. Do you know bookkeeping? I said, the rudiments, not much. He said, then I will teach you. That every day you come here, and first he had me come over and sit beside him on his Vyasa-san like this. And he had Mukunda bring some paper, and he began to show me double entry bookkeeping, expenses and costs. And meticulously, he would have me bring the books up every day. And if they missed by a few pennies, he would be on my case. He could see my heart wasn't in bookkeeping or being a treasurer at all. I'm a spendthrift when it comes to money. But that was his practical aspect. He always associated with us or brought us into his charmed us in a practical way. He employed us in Krishna service however he could, and sometimes tricked us just to get us to do some service. But by sitting next to him there on that first morning, then I knew beyond any doubt. You know, I'd been reading autobiography of a yoga and yogi and all this kind of Tibetan book, all those kind of books that were prevalent in those days, commonly available about yoga and mysticism. So I had a little idea what to expect in a spiritual master. And Prabhupada didn't levitate, or he didn't, flash my eyes or make anything crazy happen to convince me. He just talked me into it. I just never felt so peaceful and at home. But that was my constant desire, is to be with him all the time as much as possible. It was the best feeling I'd ever had. And I'd tried every kind of intoxicant there was, every kind of sensual thrill there could possibly be that in those days was available. And nothing matched that peace and tranquility and exhilaration of being with Prabhupada. That's what I liked. The exhilaration, the excitement of he was almost like a pirate, you know. We were all members of his crew. We were fearless too. He told us, that's right, he made it very clear when we were first starting out that You stay high when you chant. You get high when you chant. You get high when you chant. You have nothing to fear when you chant. You have nothing to fear when you chant. Those were his main ways of selling us on this idea. And it worked. I mean, everybody experienced a high. Prabhupada would come down every morning at 7 to the temple room, and every evening at 7, and personally lead the kirtan. For an hour, we would have these hour-long kirtans every morning and every night. Just the same old standard melody, none of this fancy stuff, no Namo Om Vishnu Padayas, no, nothing about Gauranatai or anything else, just straight Hare Krishna. And the hippies off the street who were there and the early fledgling devotees would we would get loaded out of our minds. When Prabhupada would stop the kirtan, everybody would just go like this, you know, wow, I feel great. And that's what hooked us. He got us on that. And then he would lecture, but not long ones, 15 minutes, simple. And then he would go home, go upstairs. And every day he did this for week after week after week. We lived a few blocks from the temple, and one time there was no money for rent. I mean, I was working as a carpenter, not making very much, and supporting a family. And a few of the other devotees, like Jagannath was a taxi driver, and he was giving all his money. And a few other devotees had jobs, but maybe less than 10%. Everyone else was a hippie, you know. So there was never enough money because we were feeding everybody on the street every day, and there was rent to pay and so on. And gas to put in our cars to go out and do programs and so on. So we were really in a bind. There was no money for rent. We were behind about 2 months, and we were in very grave danger of being evicted. The landlord had severely gotten down on us. And Malti and I walked out on the street, on Ashbury Street, in front of our place there, one morning early to go to the temple, to walk to the temple for kirtan. And there were all these $100 bills blowing down the sidewalk. One after another. We just started running around the street picking up $100 bills. There wasn't a person on the street. No one ever figured out where that came from. But these kind of things, I could always hearken back to the magic days of Prabhupada. These are kind of things we began to expect of Krishna. Prabhupada, another thing he inculcated for us from an early day is that if you take a risk for Krishna and stick your neck out to spread Krishna consciousness, Krishna must help you personally. And those who see Krishna closest take the biggest risk for him. And we tested that to the max, and it worked. We got to see Krishna. We got to see $100 bills rolling down the street. This spirit has died down. This spirit has died down. We're too comfortable. One time, I remember someone asked him when we'd taken a stroll down down Haight Street. There were thousands of hippies gathered in the street on a daily basis, and we walked several blocks down the street to the temple. And somebody asked him, Prabhupada, Swamiji, he wasn't Prabhupada yet, Swamiji, what do you make of all this? And he looked at that person like, no big deal. I'm a Calcutta boy. This is nothing. Well, at the time, Malati, my wife, and myself, and all of us, of course, in the Haight-Ashbury district, were very much attracted to things Indian. And there was a new shop in town in San Francisco down at Fisherman's Wharf called Import Plus or something like that, Import Plaza. And they always had a lot of Indian stuff in there. And we especially Malati used to shop there a lot. And she was a bit of a kleptomaniac too. We didn't have much money, so this is from the hippie days, going out with the bags of groceries and stuff like that, other soup. Anyway, I don't know if I should say this, Malati, but please forgive me. She saw this little doll. I mean, there were 3 of them, 3 bins full of 3 distinctly different dolls. And she copped Jagannath, Lord Jagannath, Krishna. the one with the big eyes and the black face. And I wasn't in the room when she showed it to Prabhupada, but apparently she just, as a matter of interest, asked him one day what it was. What is this? And it just blew Prabhupada's mind. He fell down on the floor and started bowing to it. That's what she told me. And he saw it as a great sign that Lord Jagannath wanted to come and live in San Francisco. So he asked her if she knew anyone who was a carpenter. At that time, I was the treasurer of the temple. And she said, oh yeah, Shyamasundar, he likes to carve wood. So Prabhupada called me up, and he had the little figurine, and he sketched it a little bit different for me. I had a drawing of some kind. And I said, sure, I can make this. And I went down to South San Francisco, where there was a harbor, barge dismantling yard. And they always had big timbers of wood there. In fact, all the Jagannaths I made from there on out, London, every place, LA, I always went to the barge dismantlers to get the big pieces of wood. Anyway, I got the wood and started carving it then on the roof of our house on Haight Street. And Prabhupada was very curious how it was coming all the time. Sometimes he telephoned. Bhaktivedanta Swami here, he'd say. Swamiji, how are you? Some devotees, when they first met him, wanted to shake his hand. We didn't know yet how to deal with all this. Prabhupada was letting us in very easily. And of course, you look at Jagannath, my God, how could anything be so outlandish? I mean, this is scary. This is so... if it could only have happened in 1967 in the Haight-Ashbury at San Francisco, California, for the last 10,000 years, it could only have happened there at that time. That people would automatically, without batting an eye, accept this is God and go with the program. Oh, that's God, okay. Cool. At least we don't know what he looks like now. So one day Prabhupada paid a surprise visit to my apartment. I was carving out on the roof of the, and there was a window that connected the roof with the apartment. I looked up and saw him leaning out the window in the apartment. Oh, so I went in and brought him to Jagannath. I showed him how I had to fill some of the spaces that, I asked him if it was all right to use plastic wood and so on to fill some of the rotted parts of the wood. Yeah, no problem. And Prabhupada was very practical in that sense. So it was done. But at the time, Bhalati reminded me of this. Prabhupada hadn't even told us really to stop smoking or anything yet. And he was we used to, God forgive us, we used to run out of his early lectures out on the street in front of Frederick Street and light up. Prabhupada. Anyway, I had a pack of cigarettes sitting on the floor there, and Prabhupada just walked by them, and with his cane he went, "Pwah!" and knocked them across the room. And just kind of looked at me and said, "You shall not smoke cigarettes anymore." And we had a dog too in the apartment. He didn't say anything about the dog. He kind of liked the dog. The dog went everywhere with us. He went on morning walks. He went to the airport to meet Prabhupada, to see him off. He rode in the car with us wherever we went. It was a I don't know, some kind of collie, miniature collie or something. Anyway, a handsome dog. He wasn't a bad dog. Anyway, and then he told Malati somewhere separately later that we should get rid of the dog. He knew I would maybe not like that very much, so he did it through my wife. Oh, Prabhupada, he was so expert in trapping us into the most outrageous movement. You have to realize the context, that there was nothing like this from the 50s, the age of small appliances and Ricky, Ozzie and Harriet. There was this slight clattering from Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and the Beat Generation somewhere in the background, but this was a revolutionary time when thousands and tens of thousands of people were opening the doors of perception and leading a radical new lifestyle that had never been done before. And Prabhupada stepped right into it and just conducted it like a ringmaster. He was right at home in the middle of it. But from that one Jagannath, to get back to your question, the one Jagannath, then he wanted them installed in other temples too, and the other temples would request them. So I made a set for New York and Los Angeles after that, and I think maybe Santa Fe or someplace else. Prabhupada was so compassionate with those around him as well, his devotees and every living entity that came into his purview was treated in a very compassionate way. I remember in the early days, what struck me, something very compassionate he said to me that made me feel good thereafter. I had, for something I had done prior to meeting Prabhupada, the law had finally caught up with me, and I had to go to jail. I didn't think it was going to be for a long period of time, but I knew it was going to be a month or two. So I went up, and Prabhupada was in San Francisco at the time, so I went up to say goodbye to him. I said, Prabhupada, I have to go away for a while. And he says, oh, where are you going? I said, well, I have to go to jail for something I did in the past. And he says, never mind. He says, Krishna was born in jail. Nothing can harm you in jail. You just chant Hare Krishna. Everything will be fine. And then at some later point in the conversation, he asked me, well, what was your offense? Why are they sending you to jail? And I told him it had to do with drugs. And he said, oh, that is such a... He says, I too was a drug dealer. He told me that once when he was, I guess he was dealing drugs, or chemicals and medicines in Allahabad and other places, and he said once some unscrupulous men approached him to use his opium buying license to illegally, and he refused to do it. Early on, in 67, maybe even, or early 68, I had proposed to Prabhupada that I would go to London and meet the Beatles. This is what I wanted to do. And I didn't realize I had thought about it at all early on. I thought it was an idea that we all came up with later, but apparently that idea grew in Prabhupada's mind, because then he sent a letter to Mukunda later in the spring of 68 saying, what do you think of Shyamasundar's idea to go to London and meet the Beatles? It was never to start a temple, it was to meet the Beatles. But somehow or other the idea grew, and the jail episode that I was telling you about earlier, the government actually, one day, even though we were stone broke, I actually got a check in the mail one day for a couple $1,000s, which was evidence being returned from that trial that I'd had in my pocket at the time of arrest. Suddenly we had all this money, and I asked Prabhupada, I got together with Mukunda and Gurdas and Jamuna and the others, and we made a kind of a plan, a proposition to Prabhupada that we all go to London. So he had given his sanction that we could go. We would use this money for all of us to go. But Malati was pregnant. We had to wait until she gave birth to Saraswati, and then a few months later till she could travel. So it was pretty well set for August of 68 that we would go. And meanwhile, Prabhupada was in Montreal, up there in Canada. He had to go for some visa problems. And so we were on our way to London. We said goodbye to everyone in San Francisco, packed up, and we were on our way to London via Montreal. Malati brought Saraswati in to meet Prabhupada. The first chat, I had called I called Prabhupada on the phone to tell him that she had been born and what was her name to be, and he said, Saraswati, over the phone. So she was named right on by Prabhupada over the phone. And then when he met her, he just lit out. She was really the first child born in the Krishna movement. And he just lit up like a light bulb, grinning ear to ear, you know, and beckoned and Malti brought her over. He just held her like this, just a swaddling, you know, 2 months old child. And finally he made the motion that somebody should take the child. He says, otherwise, what people will say, what kind of sannyasi am I? But there on after, as she grew, Prabhupada developed a very special rapport with her. And it was almost expected that every morning, if we happened to be living in the same house with Prabhupada somewhere, that she would get up and go in his room, usually before anybody else. We'd all come in and she'd be sitting there having had a long talk with Prabhupada, even though she couldn't talk yet. Prabhupada just loved her, and he loved to goad her and make her cry. All kinds of things he would do to make her cry. One time when I was destined to go somewhere, he said, well, you know, your father's going far away. He may never come back. She starts going like this, and then but he says, I think, mate, you want to go with him? Yes, Prabhupada. All right, then we can put you in one of his suitcases and pack you up tight. And you may have to travel for several days like that inside the box. And she started crying. I just burst in laughter. He loved to show her off in India. When we first came, by then she was about 3 or so, and she was able to dance and chant on the stage. He'd request her to come up and dance every night at those Pandal programs and stuff, because it just captured India to see this. Prabhupada did things like he had a wedding on stage. You know, he married a couple of Western devotees. He had all these white elephants dancing up there. He really put on a show in Cross Maidan that just put us on the map here, basically. He always made you feel like his friend. He listened to what you had to say and took your puniest achievements. He overlooked all your glaring outrages and took your puniest achievements and made them very big. I'll never forget this. I had worked hard on this Berry Place temple, several months building carpentry, and we didn't have the devotees to help then in those days. There were only 3 or 4 of us total, and a couple of English boys, new English boys. So it was pretty much a one-man job. And I was going to stick to the standard that I'd set out when I designed it, even though Prabhupada was in England pushing me day and night to finish this thing so he could get on with things. But he respected the fact that I wanted it done just right, because it was going to be a central showplace in what was then the most happening city in the world, and right in the main street, and that people who saw it should see something perfectly done. I was determined to make it that way, and Prabhupada went along with that for months, despite his discomfort. And one day after we walked, it was finished. The deities had been inaugurated. We took a walk in the park one morning shortly thereafter. We were walking back in. Prabhupada looked at the front of the temple, and he looked it up and down, and he motioned to, I believe it was to Gurudas or Mukunda, and he said, you shall put a plaque on the front of this door. And he showed with his cane beside the door a place where he wanted the plaque, a brass plaque. And you will put on that plaque, this temple has been built by the hard labor of Shyamasundar Das. There you go. Well, we took this idea of just doing anything that we wanted for Krishna, no matter how it might appear outrageous to anyone else. It was very common for us to think something could not be, I mean, there was no such thing as an impossible situation, and we just did everything. And that's a good case in point, because without any building permits, we gutted the whole interior of this building in downtown London. Took out the the first floor story and made it 2 stories high until the building inspectors caught us, Mr. Savage and Mr. Black. Typical English bureaucrats. So they were quite. They'd seen we'd already done it, so they were quite willing to go that extra mile, help us out a little bit, you know. But we had to comply with certain regulations, and these steel beams were going to be very expensive. They had to be 50 or 60 feet long, and it's one single throw, and be I-beams, steel, very heavy. And somehow we had to get them into the ceiling. So, and we had no money. We had no money. So I went to Mick Jagger of Rolling Stones and asked him. He said, "Oh yeah, just have my secretary give you a check." So he bought them. Those days we rubbed elbows with those characters. You know, we after we lived at John Lennon's house, we still maintained contact with all the Beatles during those times, and interacted with them whenever we needed something or whenever they needed something. One day John Lennon called up and asked if I could come and carve a piano for him, that Yoko wanted a Krishna carved in the music stand in the front of her piano, white piano. And the piano was in the ground floor of Apple Studios on Savile Row, next to the recording studio. So it took about a month, but I carved a very nice Krishna in that piano. And during that time, happened to be just after Brian Jones had died of the Rolling Stones, and they were breaking in a new guitar player named Mick Taylor. And so they borrowed the Apple Studios to bring Mick Taylor up to date on all their songs. So I had live Rolling Stones for a month while I worked. Hey, you get off my cloud, and over and over. And we thought nothing of it. This was just an ordinary thing. And Prabhupada made us feel that. He always appreciated going for the top, going for the highest people, the realms and spheres of influence to accomplish spreading Krishna consciousness, to accomplish the desire of his spiritual master. I'd met George and become his friend, and then subsequently the other devotees, there were only 6 of us, went over to his home and had kirtan one Sunday. And he got into it, so it was such an incredible kirtan, ecstatic kirtan. It went on for hours. There used to be a recording of that. I suppose it's long lost now, but George and everybody took turn playing all the instruments. George had a big sit-down white harmonium, and no, it was a foot pedal with foot pedals.
That was his?
Yeah, that was his. And that was just after his Maharishi days, and he was all dressed in his Indian clothes. And anyway, so we had this long kirtan. At the end of it, George says, "You know, we ought to make a record." Okay. We got together one night soon thereafter and just cut a track, and it became a very big smash. Prabhupada used to love to get our record sales reports in by letters, you know. He'd call up or telegram, congratulations, and he was always, even from far away, I was talking about his management skill, he would keep us going over there. And he would always inculcate a kind of transcendental competition among the devotees. That so-and-so is doing this, what are you doing? You know, like, it was never bitter or anything like that. If it got out of hand, then it did sometimes even. But, so we always tried to strive not only to please Prabhupada the most, but to outdo our god brothers, sisters. So the record was cut, and then, and this was kind of, the way it worked out, Prabhupada really wanted to come. He wanted to come to London so bad after that. The record was out, we were becoming #1 in the nation and all over Europe. But we kept saying, "Oh, you can't come yet, Prabhupada, there's no place to stay." And finally he just announced, "I am coming." So we raced around, and I asked John Lennon if he could stay out there. He said, "Sure, why not?" He says, "You can all stay out there and help me work on my new house." He treated George like an old friend. By the way, I spent some time with George this summer. We're talking 1999 now. And George has reached a very high level of spiritual development, I'm happy to say. He chants Hare Krishna every day. And he's totally serene and has accepted life as it is. He's realized, he's actually achieved a much higher level of self-realization than I can ever hope to achieve. He's peaceful and serene to a degree that only is rare in a person. And at such a young age. He's the same age I am. But Prabhupada benefited him so much. I mean, he knew the buttons to push and not to push because of their natural hesitancy to have anything public to do with Prabhupada. Because they would see us then as just going after their money or their fame, not giving them the real thing. So I tried, and Prabhupada, by his example, showed me that, yes, the way to treat them is like this. Always give them, just keep giving them stuff, giving them. Never ask them for anything. Although one time, Prabhupada did call me in his room and he said, "You know, we only have one book. We have Bhagavad Gita. That's it." And maybe there was an nectar of devotion, but he said, "Our Krishna book has been finished now for some time, and I got news today that it's ready for publication. How can we publish? We need this book." He said, "I want you to go and ask George for the money for this book." That's the birds. Okay. That fits right in with the story, don't cut it. So then I said, "Oh no, Prabhupada," I said, "You know, the reason that we're this far with George and he's helped us so much to date is that I've never asked him for anything. I always wait until he offers." And he said, "Yes," he said, "but we really need this." And I said, "Well, how much is it?" $19,000. In those days, that was like saying $100,000. So I said, I don't really think it's a good idea, Prabhupada." And he said, yes, it is. You'll see, Krishna will help you. Watch this. So the next day, we had made arrangements to go look at marble. George had donated, or said he would donate a slab of marble for the, what was it? Yeah, a new slab of marble for the altar, yeah, the Berry Place altar. Or maybe it was for Bhaktivedanta Manor, I don't remember. But it was a big slab of marble, and to help us select this marble, he had called on his friend David Wynne, who was the sculptor laureate of England, a very famous sculptor who designed the coinage and did those famous busts of Queen Elizabeth and of the Beatles too. That's how I knew him. So we went over to, we went with David Wynne to the marble yards and selected the marble, and afterwards we went to David Wynne's house for dinner. And all this time I was trying to screw up my courage because I had one mission that day. How am I going to ask George for this money? Here he is giving us this 3,000 or 4,000 pound slab of marble, and how can I ask him for something more on top of that today? So we got to the dinner and we were all finished with eating, and it was getting late at night. It was dark, and it was a long ways in Wimbledon, a long ways from London. I still had to go, and so did George. He had to go all the way out to someplace, suburb. So finally I just did it. I said, "George, I made Prabhupada the bad guy." Srila Prabhupada asked me to ask you if you would donate money to print Krishna book. And I explained what Krishna book was. and his face just increasingly got grimmer and grimmer. And I could see this whole thing passing through his face of, oh man, they're just another one of these groups. Here it comes. He said, how much, and no, and then on, and then the room went quiet for a moment. Well, he thought about it and looked at me, fixed me with this really belligerent stare, and suddenly the lights went out. All the lights in the house went out, and wham! This bolt of lightning hit the house. It's a true story. The whole house shook. It hit the house. The sound and the light were simultaneous. And we sat in silence for some minutes after that, stunned. The lights came back on. I looked over at George, and he had this huge grin on his face. He said, well, how much is it then? And I told him, and he says, well, what can I do after that? You know? Then he came the next day and talked to Prabhupada about it. Prabhupada came to Portland, Oregon. My parents lived near Salem, Oregon, south of Portland. And he came to Portland, Oregon once to visit the temple there. And Donavir, who was the president, had arranged a radio program in Salem, Oregon with KSLM. And so we drove down there, and I had my parents come over and meet him in the studio. So they sat in the studio and listened to the whole Prabhupada's talk. And actually, my mother came down to my wedding in Haight-Ashbury. Can you imagine this? This is the first wedding was Balaji and I in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, in this storefront on Haight Street, near Haight Street. And it was a full-on fire yajna. You know, we weren't sure how to do it or anything, but we had wood burning there, and the smoke was filling the room up. And ghee was flying everywhere, and rice. And my mother, the squarest lady in the world, comes down from Salem, Oregon, and finds her way to this place, and sits down with all these hundreds of outlandish hippies, and all this chanting, and noise, and kirtan. And actually, it changed her life very significantly. At first, she was very critical of it, but gradually she began to accept it. Till in her final years, she was very spiritually oriented.
Do you remember the interchange that Prabhupada happened? Did he greet them?
I don't. You know, he was very friendly, of course. Oh, I remember he said that to my father. He said, "Oh, you have produced such a nice devotee as a son." He said, "This will have very great benefit for you also." He said, "You will now be able to escape the pangs of old age, death, and disease, because your son will take you there." It's to your credit, he said. And he said, oh, and I remember he also said, you realize, don't you, that your son, he's the son of a very prominent attorney in Salem, Oregon, and he's a very intelligent and educated boy, that he has chosen this philosophy for a reason. He was implying that Krishna consciousness could attract the intelligence of anyone, that it was on a very high level. My parents appreciated that, the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. They knew I wouldn't do it foolishly. Although I was known to do crazy things, the fact that I stuck with it meant a lot to them. And then, of course, when my father got to come over and meet George and stay at his house, that put the icing on the cake. My whole aspiration in life was to grab as much of Prabhupada's attention as I possibly could and be with him personally as much as I could possibly be, because I experienced my greatest pleasure my whole life in those moments. So I caught on early on that what Prabhupada really liked was to talk to important or famous people. Right in the beginning, whenever he would come to London, we'd have all these people scheduled for him to meet and talk with him. We could keep him there month after month by saying, Prabhupada, we've got 3 months worth of famous speakers coming here. You have to stay. He couldn't refuse. Nobody else caught on to that. So, but sometimes I would take other devotees too. Many times he would ask, especially with scientists, Swarup Damodar would be the scientist, or Hayagriva would be the philosopher. Many devotees, he played that way. But he knew I'd studied philosophy in college. So. He was a philosophy major also in college. Scottish Teachers College. He majored in philosophy. One time Prabhupada met with Arnold Toynbee, who was a famous English historian, well known for his studies of Greece. He was the Greek scholar of all time so far. And we met with him face to face. Part of this is not on the tape that was recorded, but I remember it. I brought up the fact that the young people of today were revitalizing society by taking to Eastern religions and religion in the East, and a kind of a mystique of Eastern religions was growing just like it did in early times in Greece. And I said, how do you feel about the West and how this fits in with Greek history? And he said, in the old times there was Athens and there was Sparta. Athens was the culture of grace and art. He said they perfected the plastic art, the art of statuary and form. He says, Sparta was the kingdom of war and militant. He says, now you have America and Russia. This was back in the 70s. He said, America has perfected the art of audio, the ear, sound vibration. That is the art of this American age. And he said, Sparta, meaning Russia, there may be a few columns left someday. Just like modern, you go to Sparta now, it's just a few columns. Athens is a thriving metropolitan city. So what he was saying, what he was saying is that America, the age of America, he said, and Prabhupada cut in and talked about how Lord Chaitanya predicted that there would be a golden age in the midst of the age of Kali where Krishna consciousness would be widespread. And Toynbee agreed that this was a very good possibility, that the blending of the Hare Krishna movement as like a parallel with the Greek mysteries, which went along with the growth of the Athenian Empire, were very similar, and that we would all experience. Toynbee was convinced that the American age has just begun. The golden age of America has just begun, he said at that time. Just begun, despite all what the doomsayers are saying. And it's coming true. Look at it. And inside that golden age of America, Krishna consciousness can flourish as its mystery, as one of its great mysteries. If the devotees of today take that opportunity and use it, there's no end to Prabhupada's movement. In the early days when the girls, Janaki, Jamuna, Malati, were cooking, taking turns cooking for Prabhupada, they always tried to introduce typical American favorites and turn Prabhupada on to these so-called delicacies. And invariably Prabhupada would, be gracious about it and say, oh, thank you, I'll try this, but always leave most of it. He didn't really like Janaki made him once artichokes, artichoke hearts, or a full artichoke with a dip, and showed him how to eat it. He ate about 2, and he says, why all this trouble, this botheration? He stuck to his dal, rice, and sabjis. And in turn taught them how to cook. But he didn't like all the American gadgets, the American tastes. I asked him once, I said, have you seen Krishna? And he said, yes. I said, what does Krishna look like? And he said, You have seen this acetylene torch. You cannot look with your eye. And then on to Moscow. Moscow. This, you have to remember and realize, was the height of the Cold War period. There were threats going back and forth between America and Russia to drop hydrogen bombs at any moment. Leonid Brezhnev was in charge in Russia in those times, and it was very paranoid and extremely repressive regime. No one was allowed in. But Prabhupada kept saying, I want to go to Russia. I want to get behind this Iron Curtain and see what's going on. Those people, they would probably like to hear about Krishna. So no one was able to ever get Prabhupada a visa. And then by some fluke, Prabhupada asked me if I could get him one in Bombay. And I went down to the Russian embassy, and that very day I secured us visas and tickets to Moscow. A couple of days later, we were on our way. Those days are hard to imagine now. I mean, even in India, there was very little of anything available in the way of consumer goods or freedoms. Things like that were very scarce. In fact, I remember thinking, well, I better have a camera of some kind to take some pictures of Prabhupada in Russia. This is a historic occasion. And I scoured the streets of Bombay and was able to find finally a small brownie box camera with just a hole in one end for a few rupees, and that was it. And one roll of black and white film that had 12 shots on it. That was it. And those have subsequently become historic photos. They all came out perfectly by Krishna's arrangement. I had no idea how to photograph anything. But anyway, there we were in Russia, and Prabhupada was just like a commander-in-chief behind the lines. You know, we knew we were being stalked by the KGB. We knew all kinds of things were happening. But in 5 short days, he was able to plant the seed of Krishna consciousness that resulted in thousands and tens of thousands of devotees growing. That's his potency. But always the daredevil, always the excitement. I mean, there's some of the things we did. There's a little known story of the time that Prabhupada met me and flew in, I believe from Bombay or America or England, flew in and met me in Zurich, and we speculated on the gold market together. We opened an account, a Swiss a bullion account, a gold bullion account in the Swiss Credit Bank, plunked down about $25,000 or $30,000, and because I had a hot tip. And I can just see Prabhupada sitting there in this lobby on Bahnhofstrasse in the elegant Swiss Credit Bank, all day long with his cane, sitting in the chair, watching the ticker tape go by. And then pretty soon, occasionally the gold price would go by and his eyes would follow it. He'd lean over to me and he'd say, shall we sell or shall we hold on our position? Finally, we sold after a few days. He said the price had tabled, it plateaued out, and it was getting boring sitting there, basically. It continued actually afterwards to go up substantially more, but Prabhupada had had enough. And he said, Shyamasundar, I think we should sell. Okay, we doubled our money. Once we were near Mayapur. We had an old, I think it was a 48 Hudson or some old car, big car, but old. And I was driving, and we had left the main road. If you've been on the main road, you know how bad that is. You can imagine what this secondary road was like. Because we were going up to Birnagar to visit Lalit Prasad, who was Bhaktisiddhanta's brother, living brother. He was a very old man then. But we didn't know the road. We didn't know the way very well. We knew that it was up that road somewhere. And we drove halfway up or so, and we came to a place. There was a cement bridge over a big gully, but the monsoon runoff had washed the bank away on both sides of the bridge for a distance of about 3 or 4 feet, as I recall. This may be an exaggeration, but it was some distance. maybe 3 feet. And we could see up and down this canal that there was no other way for the automobile to cross, and we still had 5 or 6 kilometers at least to go. So Prabhupada studied the situation. He didn't even get out of the car. He just studied the situation a little bit. Ramananda and some of the other big guys in back, Bhavananda, somebody else, he said, "You boys get out. Shyamasundar, you back up and get going very fast, and we will make it." I got back at 50 feet or so and just gunned that old tank. And off we went. Whoa! We flew over that first gap, screaming across that cement bridge. Whoa! Flying. Looked like a Steve McQueen Great Escape movie. And the boys walked down around and got back in, and off we went. Expert at everything. Engineer also. He always used to know everything about engineering. He used to make drawings. In fact, it may not be well known how early the Mayapur project was actually started, long before what they're saying in their chronology. Back in, right after Tamal, or somebody got that first little tiny few bighas of land in Mayapur, Prabhupada planned the whole thing out one day in London, the very place, and sketched it all out, the temples and the buildings. And he asked me if there was any English devotees that were architects or knew anything. There was one, Ranchor. He called Ranchor up, and Narayan was there, the builder. So he had them come up, and he submitted this idea to them and says, "We have only a few days till I must leave. I want you to work on a plan for a huge complex at Mayapur." And that's all he thought about for days. And this must have been 71 or 2. And we'd walk in the park in Russell Square every morning then, and he would point to different buildings, and he would ask Ranchor and Narayan questions. You knew he knew the answers already, but he would ask, testing their abilities. And expert at everything. That was Prabhupada. And yet, there was for all of this vitality and excitement and adventurism and dynamic vibration around Prabhupada, there was an ineffable air of shell, almost like of softness. You felt it when you got within a foot or two of Prabhupada's actual physical body, that it was cooler and it was soft. There was some kind of a soft cushion there. I know others who have probably massaged him and served him have felt that also. It was like entering an air-conditioned room. It was totally calm around his body, in a halo. He was one of the other qualifications of a saint is silence. Sometimes Prabhupada would, I swear, he would talk to me and not open his mouth. I'd look up, and he'd just be looking at me. And I would have heard a full conversation in my head. Sometimes when I was writing letters, this happened many times. I always had the feeling something else was guiding my hand when I was typing these letters for Prabhupada. I could hear his words ringing in my ears. I could type them with my eyes closed, and everything would be all right. They came out just perfect. There would be someone who would ask a strange question or an esoteric question from some scripture which I had no clue about. And I just let my mind go, and Prabhupada would throw the answer in there. And I always, I'd check it back with him and run it for him, and he'd sign it. Prabhupada was so expert that he expanded himself. In fact, probably the greatest area of his expertise was his ability to manage. I mean, it has to be seen in context what Prabhupada did. From a single individual with absolutely no resources, and just his words, he was able to build a worldwide society of people, global society, long before what we're calling the age of globalization, which is right now. This was long before, when we couldn't even find videotapes or cassette tapes, even the old cassette cartridges, anywhere else in the world but America. We used to have to wait in line at the post office in Bombay for 2 days to make a long-distance call. if we were lucky. Forget about communication. Forget about any of this. And yet Prabhupada had a worldwide organization in 3 or 4 years built up. How he managed this should be studied. But I was fortunate to be there right at the most exciting time when all of this really kind of hit the fan, and Prabhupada came up with this idea. He called me, and he was becoming overburdened with his management and was complaining about not having time to translate because we had no books either during these early days. We only finally got Bhagavad Gita years after we met Prabhupada. And nothing to distribute. So Prabhupada had a twofold task. He had to keep us all organized somehow, plus he had to provide us with the books. Imagine. So in order to provide himself with the time to translate, he came up with this idea of a GBC, a governing body commission. He called me in early one morning. And this idea sprang from his head, full-blown, like he'd probably been thinking about it for a long time. And sleepless nights. I never saw him sleep. So I'm sure that he was working on his managerial problems during that time. And he said, Shyamasundar, take dictation. Henceforth, I want to govern the society this way. And you write it down and send copies of this out to the various leaders whom I shall appoint. And his idea was, at that time and forevermore, to divide the world into 12 zones. And that each of these zones would be managed by one person, and that person would be a householder or someone who had business experience. Tamal Krishna Goswami was the one exception at the time because he had just taken sannyas very recently, and Prabhupada allowed him to be the GBC for India because he was the only qualified man at the time. There were no Indian devotees had yet come up. So he wanted householders, managers, businessmen to run his society and manage all the business affairs. And the sannyasis should be free and should roam from zone to zone, wherever their feet would take them, and preach, period. Now I think those two functions have gotten intermixed and diluted. I know Prabhupada's original intent, and it was not to change. That was it. And he even said, he sent a letter out to the 12 GBC men. He said, but this shall be a democracy, and if there are matters that affect the whole society, then you shall all vote. And the unanimous, because we are a democracy, the unanimous vote will hold. And if there's a deadlock, I will throw the remaining vote, but only if it's a grievous error. Somebody must have a copy of that original. It's in the database, the original letter like that.
You see that?
Yeah. He would call me in some mornings and say, "Oh, we have 4 invitations here, from Los Angeles, from Tokyo, from this place, that place, all rather ordinary big cities, and this one from Brahmananda in Africa. What do you think we should do?" I would say, "Prabhupada, Africa, we've never been to Africa." "Yes, let us go to Africa. Make arrangements." He got bored with sitting around the established temples. He loved it, of course, but he knew while he had the energy, and that period of time was ripe for just spreading Krishna consciousness, throwing the seeds out there as far as he could, fast as he could. Africa, God, that was an eye-opener. Black Africa, wow. Brahmananda had been there, and a couple of other boys, but they'd more or less gotten allied with the Indian community in Nairobi and had not made many inroads into the African community. So shortly after he arrived, Prabhupada was talking to Brahmananda and asking him, had he been having kirtans in public yet? Brahmananda said, "No, Prabhupada." Brahmananda, a huge guy, fearless it seems, was intimidated by the whole idea. And Prabhupada says, "Okay, then you all will go, now there are 4 of you, you will go for kirtan in Nairobi." So Ramananda, the other boy who was there, myself, and Aravinda, who was Prabhupada's other servant, went out one afternoon, just scared to death. I mean, on the way there, we saw this guy walking down the street with a bloody zebra skin over his... When we came into land, they had to make 2 swoops because there were some giraffes on the runway. And there was this guy with this bloody zebra skin with blood running down his back, walking in front of us on the sidewalk. Well, it's nothing compared to Gargamuni and those guys who had gone across, well, and Brahmananda, who had already gone across Turkey and into Pakistan. I mean, Prabhupada sent us out in these wild places. And so we very hesitantly started up our little kirtan in the middle of this city park under a tree. And within no time, hundreds of Africans gathered around. And this was, I think it was rather a low-class section of town. They didn't have much money. But they just loved it. We began to see that these people, wow, they were chanting back to us. Once they knew the words, we were holding up the words like that, and they were chanting them back. And they got into it, and they were dancing, and kirtan went on great. It was just fascinating to see it. And afterwards, I think Brahmananda gave a little talk, and the one question they had was if we had a book. If we had the book. And we said, yep, we got the book. We got the book right here. And from that day on, Krishna consciousness was rooted in Africa. Devotees started coming, black African devotees. So Prabhupada was always out there on the cutting edge in the wilds. He didn't like the sedate. He did, he liked it all. The first quality of a pure devotee is described as being merciful. Just being with us was Prabhupada's mercy enough. I mean, every aspect of his behavior was very merciful. That he even deigned to be with us was his greatest act of mercy, I believe. But as just a little concrete example, I remember once, as his secretary, I was in charge of all of his travel arrangements. And at this period of time, he was traveling very fast all over the world. I had to go and buy the plane tickets and make the arrangements on both sides, who would pick him up, all that kind of stuff, how he would get to the airport and so on. We had been in Africa, his first trip to Africa, Nairobi. And from there he was to go to India, Bombay. So they had made some huge pandal program for him in Bombay on his arrival, and thousands of people were to greet him at the airport. So I went down to the East African Airlines ticket counter in Nairobi, bought the tickets, we got on the plane, and we flew to India. We got off the plane in Bombay, and the first person we met was the health officer. And he said, can I see your yellow fever inoculations cards, please? I looked at Prabhupada and I said, I don't have one, we don't have one. And I said, we don't have them. And the guy said, oh, then you will have to go into quarantine. So I felt like my whole bottom had dropped out of my life, that my whole world had come to an end, that I had caused this problem, this major problem by an oversight. Because Prabhupada was so meticulous in all of his arrangements, and he tried to inculcate that into me, and I really tried hard to make sure everything went well all the time. Well, I really blew this. Here we were, we could either get back on a plane and go back to Nairobi, or we could go out to a prison-type place with screened windows and be in quarantine for 2 weeks. And no matter how I ranted and raved, they wouldn't back down. And they said even if Indira Gandhi came and she didn't have her yellow fever shot from Africa, she couldn't get in. And I didn't want to look at Prabhupada during all this. I just knew he'd just be smoldering with anger at me. Finally, I looked over at him and I said, Prabhupada, we have to go to this quarantine. And he looked at me with a big grin on his face. He said, that's all right, we need the rest anyway. after about 10 days there, no one was allowed to come in. We couldn't go out. Prabhupada was getting a very good rest, a lot of translating. We were getting caught up on all the correspondence. Finally, after I think about the 10th or 11th day of this, Prabhupada called me in and he said, you know, I have yellow fever certificate. He said, you call Jayapataka in Calcutta and tell him that it's in the right-hand drawer of my desk or blah, blah. He gave directions and ask him to fly it here. Next day, Jayapataka flew there with his yellow fever certificate, and Prabhupada got to leave a day earlier than we did. Now, you can look at that different ways, but in my way of looking at it, being there at the time, Prabhupada knew that he had this there, but he wanted the rest. Nobody disturbed him for about 10 days, and this was during a very active globe-trotting period. He got caught up on everything, and then when he was done, he got out. He was faultless. You could say, oh, he forgot, or he made a mistake. No way. Prabhupada never did. Anytime you could say, well, Prabhupada just made a mistake. If you really looked at it, it wasn't a mistake. It was all a part of his leela, his playtime with us. Another thing about Prabhupada was his unpredictability. I don't think ever, in all the years and encounters with Prabhupada, that I ever felt anything when I was still outside the door waiting to go in, but a surge of excitement that I'm about to enter the unknown. Even after being with him every day for year after year, every time I opened that door to his room, I had this utter elation that I'm about to enter into a world of surprise, some kind of surprise, because you could never tell what Prabhupada was going to say or do. Never. You could never predict it. As soon as you thought he was going to react to something one way, he'd be just the opposite. I remember once we were in Moscow. We had gone to Russia. We only had a few things with us, and one of the things that Prabhupada had was his lota, which he took into the bathroom. He left in the bathroom. One day I was able, these were the Brezhnev times when food stuff was very scarce. One day I was able to get a hold of and buy some rice. I believe a kilo or two, quite a bit of rice. It was very bad quality rice, but we had some rice finally. So Prabhupada said, oh, cook it all up. And I'd also found a good supply of milk at a dairy. So we had milk and we had rice. And Prabhupada said, cook it all up, we will make sweet rice. And Aurobindo said, but Prabhupada, we don't have enough containers to put all this sweet rice in. He had filled all the pots that we had, the few pots that we had with rice, and there was still a bunch left in the hotel's pot. We didn't know what to do, to throw it away, keep it. Prabhupada said, go in the bathroom and get my lota. And Aurobindo said, oh, but Prabhupada, that's dirty, you use it in the bathtub. And Prabhupada said, never mind, we will save this sweet rice for our sustenance. So he brought it from the bathroom and filled the lota with sweet rice. I remember one time in Mexico, somebody had given Prabhupada a room, a nice, simple, but very clean room in a Mexican home, and he had gone in for a nap after lunch. And about an hour or so later, he rang his little bell, and I came, and he was sitting on the end of his bed, staring at this crucifix on the wall with this tortured image of Christ on it. And there were a couple of tears coming out of his eyes. He said, Shyamasundar, would you please remove this? They have killed their spiritual master so that they can sin. Wow. Prabhupada was a poet of great renown. I mean, in my estimation, I read a lot. I always have. I've always been, I even majored in literature in college, and I've always been very critical of writers and speakers. And Prabhupada, there was never a time that he gave a lecture or gave a conversation or wrote something that didn't just astound me afterwards, that I could, that I went right to the last word with. And each time I would hear one of his lectures, I realized how he was weaving it like a tapestry, like a fully professional poet would weave a lecture. And then he would just go boom, 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 boom. Thank you very much. Just astounding. I've always appreciated that. He was the wordsmith beyond compare. We can't even begin to emulate that. He said once, when I was Charles Darwin, he said, "Your ancestors might have been cavemen," he said, "but mine were poets." I think one of the other qualifications of pure devotee that Prabhupada always exhibited also was his freedom from desire for material possessions. Basically, Prabhupada was totally renounced. I remember one incident where in Hyderabad, I had met some jewelers who were former jewelers to the Nizam, so they had a collection of fabulous gems, and they wanted me to help sell them in the West. So they gave me on consignment a big necklace about this big of giant rubies, each one this big, beads, and a similar necklace of emeralds that size. I mean, these were worth a fortune. And I brought them back to, and Prabhupada was in his room, so I showed them to him, and I put them around his neck. I said, "Prabhupada, I'd really like to see you in these jewels." And he put his neck, and I put them on. He leaned back, and he had this kind of pleased expression on his face. I said, "Prabhupada, these jewels belong on you." And he said, "Yes, you may leave them here for some time." And then I left. And the next morning they were on his desk. Now you take these out of here. Anytime anyone gave him anything of value, a watch, there wasn't much in the way of anything he would give Prabhupada except a few small things that he wore occasionally. A watch, a ring, these were favorite items, a set of buttons for his shirts or whatever of any value. He would wear them for a few days and then give them to some devotee. Or if somebody gave him something, he would exchange his watch or his ring, something times very valuable. I remember I bought him I was in Switzerland once, and on Bahnhofstrasse I saw the very first limited edition of the quartz digital watches. This was about 1972 or 3, something like that. When they first came out, this guy made the first 1,000 limited edition Gublein. And I bought one. I didn't really have the money, but I spent everything I had and bought him one of these watches because they look so cool with those red letters on there. Nobody had ever seen these quartz digital letters. All it did is give the time when you pressed the button. That's all. It didn't do anything else. But it was a big gold watch. And I gave it to Prabhupada, and he just loved that watch. He'd sit there and play with it all, show it to everybody. Look, do you want to know what time it is? And, it had the hundreds of seconds going on. Click, 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 click. But he, a few days later, he wasn't even wearing it. Somebody else had it. Prabhupada never accumulated anything. He always had everything in full. Krishna provided for him in full. In the books, Prabhupada taught us, and in his lectures, that Krishna is the supreme proprietor of all energies. And that even the small jiva energies are really, we are not the proprietor of our energies. The energy is transcendental. And he not only taught us in our books that, to understand that intellectually, but he exhibited that himself many times. There were times when I thought Prabhupada would just be ready to die from fatigue. We would go from morning to night all over the world. He would run from one lecture to another in somebody's house, and he'd be looking exhausted, and I'd say, "Okay, we're going to bed now, Prabhupada." And I'd just get him in his room. Some people would show up out there, and I'd say, "Well, no, you can't see him just now. There's some ordinary people." Prabhupada would hear him out there, and he'd say, "Let them come in." And he'd talk into the night with these people about their families and their problems. And he just kept going. Then I'd crash. I'd go to sleep finally. His light would still be on. And I'd wake up at some point, usually with his bell ringing. I always slept in my clothes. And his light would still be on. I never saw him sleep. I can't remember, even in those train compartments when we'd travel together around India in two-bed compartments. I don't remember him looking at him with his eyes closed, sleeping. I would see him sometimes laying there with his eyes closed, but he always knew what was going on around him. I mean, sure enough, as soon as I looked at him, one had opened like this. I mean, he was just so aware. So I learned early on that energy is not, we're not, this little body is not the source of our energies. Once it becomes Krishna conscious. As long as it's allied with the material nature, yeah, it's very limited. We can crash in a minute. Crash and burn all the time. But as soon as you start getting wound up about Krishna, I mean, we've seen it. Everyone has seen this happen. Not only with Prabhupada, but with devotees. Look at Malati, how she's overcome her illness through Krishna consciousness. Purely, it's a miracle. No one can believe it. The miracle of modern medicine. Nobody can understand it. Once Prabhupada in London, I think others have maybe talked about this incident. I was sleeping outside of his room in Berry Place, and I heard in my dreams, I heard very faintly, Shyamasundar. And I crashed awake like this and hit the bunk. I was on the lower bunk of a wooden bunk bed, and crashed my head on the bunk above me and staggered out. And the door was just opening when I got to it, and Prabhupada was standing there, reeling, and then he just collapsed in my arms. My God, I just was stunned. I didn't know what in the world to do. And I picked him up, and it was like he didn't weigh anything. There was no weight. He felt like a little pillow or something. Absolutely no weight whatsoever. And eyes were closed and gray-faced. And I went over to his bed, and I laid him down, and he was shivering. So I began to heap blankets over him. And then he opened his eyes and said, "I'm cold." So I went over and I turned the heat up as far as it would go and got some more blankets and covered him up. And I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to call a hospital, get an ambulance, what was going on. And he said, "Bring a little black pepper paste." He told me how to make it or something. So I ran down the kitchen and brought us up and put it on his forehead. And he says, "Now you just lay down there and sleep. No hospital." And I ran around. His room was right over the temple room. So I ran around to the pujaris and woke him up. And I said, "Look, at Mangala Arati, which is in about an hour, no bells, just quiet, no singing loud. Prabhupada needs to rest." So he slept probably 5 hours or so. He got up. I slept right on the floor there. I didn't really sleep, I don't believe. I think I stayed awake most of the night just watching. His breathing was deep but normal. But even then, he wasn't sleeping. Every time I would get really, really worried and look up at him, his eyes would open. Like, I'm okay. And then in the morning, he got up, said, "It's time for our morning walk," and carried on as if nothing happened. Now you tell me where that energy comes from. It's not possible. And I saw it so many times. Immediately friend to everyone is one of the prominent attractive. Prabhupada has said that in this material world, that relationships that we use to anchor ourselves in the material nature, like husband, wife, sister, brother, friend, are just dim reflections of the transcendental. You grieve when you can't be with your friend, huh? Why tears? It's not lamentation. It's just wishing so hard that you could be here. It's pretty selfish. Huh?
No, more people.
Prabhupada always said that it's the desire of every human or every living entity to have peace and be satisfied. That's what we want. That's our nature. And whenever Prabhupada was in my presence, I always felt that to the ultimate. It's the only time. So his friendliness. And he wasn't just a friend to me, he was a friend to everyone. And everyone had relationships with him who met him in some way or other. And I'm hoping, I'm praying that we have an eternal relationship, and that we're together again. It's my only reason for existence. But also Prabhupada said that friendship is two-sided. That the friend reciprocates. We were talking once about Queen Elizabeth. David Wynne had recently done her bust, and he had given her a copy of Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. I asked him if he could, while she's sitting there for hours, and while he's designing her bust, just slide her this copy of Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita and let her thumb through it. And she did one day while he was sitting there for hours. She looked at Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, and David Wynne relayed this, that she amusedly at one point looked up with a bemused look on her face, faraway look, and said, Krishna is Krishna, the friend of everyone, and Krishna is responsible for everything and everyone, something like that. She said, wouldn't that be wonderful? Krishna, the friend of everyone. And Prabhupada, when he heard the story, he said, yes, he said, Krishna is the friend of everyone, but there must be reciprocation. That is what she's missing. You can't just become Krishna's friend. I mean, you're his friend, but you can't become his friend without reciprocation. So Prabhupada was friends with everyone, even those who didn't reciprocate. Just because they exist, they were his friends. But with certain people who served Krishna, he was especially friends. And his expertise, I would say always, I go back to that, how expert he was at everything. And there's another one, faultless. Prabhupada had no errors in any of his, either his behavior or his actions, his words, anything. There was never any mistake. I mean, even so-called superficial mistakes, like, I left my glasses behind or something like that. There would always be a very good reason why that was done. And I saw a lot of years of that in order to make that. That's not a light observation. That's after long study of every movement Prabhupada made. I could never find any mistake. So when you find such a person, how can you let them go? Especially when Prabhupada says that you can become like me too. He always held that out for us. You do this, this, and this, this, and this, and you can become a self-realized soul, a pure devotee of Krishna. Otherwise, what hope is there? What hope have we got? I mean, if we're just idolizing a person who's reached that without any hope of attaining it ourselves, what's the point? And Prabhupada always encouraged us to come up the trail a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And he always said, it made us feel better whenever we fell down, that whatever you have done up to date will be counted on your credit side of your ledger. That's going to be a long time yet, boy, for me. Wow. Prabhupada was so, who knows how it happened, how many lifetimes or whatever he went through to achieve the birth he did, and in a devotee family where he never had any, although he does say that he had many temptations too. He was from an aristocratic family, so he had access to all the then new things that were coming out, like movies and electricity and all the gadgetry and the intoxication and stuff that was going on. But there was something that prevented him from doing any of that. So he never had a thought that wasn't Krishna conscious, hardly from his birth. How are we to wipe away so much trash that we've accumulated? Only by his mercy.
Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu
Anilo